Can you imagine if Innocent III could tweet? What if Luther had had a Facebook page?
Interested in more stories about the Bible, saints, European history, and more? See thousands of videos from professors at renowned Catholic University. Subscribe now at CatholicStream.com.
John Paul II was involved in political affairs as much as he was involved in religious affairs. In fact, the first decade of his papacy is devoted, not exclusively, of course, but devoted to getting rid of communism in his homeland. But not just to free his homeland, he was putting it in the context of global human rights and the rights of workers to organize and to take care of their families. Human beings, he said, are more important than capitalism and communism. But he was as involved in political affairs as any medieval pope was. He was a player far beyond Rome. From 1600 to 1900, most popes are players just in Rome. In fact, when the pope is stuck in the Vatican and there's no papal states, from about 1870 to about 1929, we even refer to him as the prisoner of the Vatican. And John Paul II, of course, played on a world stage because he knew how to play to that camera and to that microphone and to the image. Medieval popes, because there was no separation between church and state, those are modern words, modern distinctions that we read back, and even back before Jesus. So if I time traveled Socrates, who died in the year 399 BCE, and I said to Socrates, I separate religion from civic life, he would look at me and say, why? That's dumb. The separation of religion from civic life is, in fact, an anomaly in the modern world. If you look back at the history of the world, religion and politics have always been united. And it's that kind of synthesis, what some people call integralism, the fact that religion is integrally related to civic life, is how John Paul II thought people of faith should be involved, that their faith and their civic life should play together. Now, of course, you know that that's a very, very bumpy ride. Every bartender knows that the two things you're not supposed to talk about are politics and religion. And that's all John Paul II wanted us to talk about. Some people called him a papal monarch. I think the last person that we could really call a papal monarch, some people refer to him as the Lord of the world, was a pope by, ironically, named Innocent III, who was a very young man even for his time to be elected pope. He was 37 years old, and he was elected pope in 1198. He died in 1216, so he's dead before he's 60. What would have happened if he had lived longer? And Innocent III is the kind of person that I think of when I think of John Paul II. Incredibly influential in terms of his appointment of bishops, incredibly influential in world affairs, and somebody who was able to transcend the bonds of these things called papal monarchy, French monarchy, and really embrace what for him was global at that point being Europe, reaching out past the borders and say, our allegiance is not to one person or to one system, it is to Jesus. And I think that John Paul II was trying to do that, to say to people that a Filipino Catholic has more in common with a Canadian Catholic, with a Brazilian Catholic, because they are Catholic. The nationalism of Brazil or Canada or the Philippines is secondary. What is your highest allegiance? Your faith, John Paul II said. And that should be what you calculate in your mind when you're making personal decisions, or when you're making decisions at your workplace, or if you choose to get involved in civic life. And he did all of that with things that those medieval monarchs didn't have. Can you imagine if Innocent III could tweet? What if Luther had had a Facebook page? All of those great historical characters. In internet, he did more with the internet, a jet plane, and 24/7 cable TV than anyone. And that's why I said earlier, he probably is the most recognized, most seen face in world history. He was a global pope for a global age. And he did that by World Youth Day, which has been in Spain, it's been in the United States, France, the Philippines, several other places. as well. And that's become kind of the Catholic Youth Olympics on the planet. And so that's guaranteeing media coverage. That's not why he did it, of course, but it's guaranteeing that we go to those young people, as he did in his own life in the 40s and the 50s when he was studying for his philosophy and theology doctorate when he was a professor, going to the young person. But there are questions for history, and I don't know that we can answer these questions just yet. One was his management style. Some people said he had no management style because he was a pope ad extra, to use the Latin. He was a pope interested in the outside world, Catholic and non-Catholic. He was a pope who said, some of the assessments at his death, he said yes to the world in the 70s, late 70s and 80s, but then as he got older, he said no to the church within Catholicism. Some people say he united the world outside Catholicism and he divided Catholics within. These are some of the assessments. Now, again, I think that these are binary, kind of Manichaean, dualistic ways of either or thinking that don't necessarily help us. I don't think he cared at all about management. It wasn't his interest, which is good because we are seeing that it wasn't his skill either. And so that he wanted other people to run the show, and it appears that the Curia under John Paul II and then also under Benedict XVI was kind of calling the shots. It's one thing to run the show in terms of keeping the trains running on time, to use that famous or infamous expression. But it's quite another thing to be making decisions that the boss should be making. And so one of the things that came out of Vatican II was the notion of collegiality, that bishops would make decisions together. And under John Paul II, he was really kind of more of an authoritarian leader. So Paul VI thought that the Synod of Bishops would be the kind of things where bishops would come together, like the early church councils, and say, you know, I have this problem, you have that problem. Okay, how are you answering the same problem in your different circumstances? Whereas under John Paul II, the Synod, and Benedict XVI, the Synod of Bishops became a thing where here's what we're going to talk about, here's what you're going to vote on, and then when you arrive, we've already talked about it, so you just vote on it, and everybody knew how the vote was going to go. So that's a criticism of John Paul II. So this extrovert pope for a church outside Rome and the Curia didn't serve within. And so the oversight, particularly, he's been hit on the oversight of the priest pedophilia crisis, especially allowing bishops to move proven priest pedophiles around, and the bishops have not been held accountable. That's a major, major criticism of his papacy. And his personal relationship with the Legionaries of Christ founder, Marcial Degollado, who was discovered to have fathered children, to have really been abusive to seminarians. Some people say that John Paul II knew and didn't do anything about it. Other people say that he didn't know. And at that point, you're at an impasse. Without the definite information, you can't make an assessment. But we do know that he was tough with people who were raising questions. A moral theologian by the name of Charles Curran, a priest, Hans Kung, and liberation theology. And there have been a lot of complaints by theologians that, yes, this is the man who ultimately is the caretaker for doctrine, but he should care for doctrine in collegiality with his other bishops and taking into account the gifts and insights of theologians. And a lot of people, Curran, Kung, and some of the liberation theologians said, you know, I feel like I didn't have any due process. So here's a pope talking about human rights, but when my case came to the Vatican, I didn't get to read the charges against me. I didn't get to sufficiently defend myself. So that's going to be kind of an open question that I think we can't answer just yet. Certainly, he promoted the notion of clericalism, which is a big problem. And this was not his fault, but a cult of personality grew up around him. Some people call it papal idolatry. Eamon Duffy, the church historian whom I mentioned earlier, coined the phrase papalatry, papal idolatry, papalatry. I don't think that that is fair to lay at the feet of John Paul II, because he is who he is. He was who he was. And it's not his fault that he was so charismatic, but the notion that there is a hierarchy of vocations is, in fact, a problem that the church is facing now. Welcome to this course on the history of the Catholic Church.
Unlock the wisdom
I want to look at Genesis 1.
of Catholic educators.
As we put the text into practice, it reveals even more.
The first question is, what is the Bible?
And it is in the Roman Empire in which Christianity is born.
So we talk about miracles. What is a miracle?
The Dead Sea Scrolls are debated.
Why do the cardinals pick the Pope?
Educate your mind, elevate your spirit. Subscribe now at CatholicStream.com.